Thank you, Hugues, very much, and thank you to the whole STARTS team for organizing this event and for inviting me to share some of my research on it. I'm going to try and keep time. I'm going to have to watch somebody to help me, because when I get excited about my research, there's so much I could tell you. And I've been, as Hugues said, I've been studying this topic really intensely since 2008, but I've been thinking about it quite a lot beforehand. So there's so much I could talk about. What I want to do is start by talking about the research that I did, which was not on arts and science, but about artistic interventions in organizations, and then relate it to the arts and science types of projects in particular. So I'll do that in several steps by looking first, what are artistic interventions, and what do I see as their radical potential? And then why is it particularly important that we have also artists in science? If we're understanding the why, then I would like to discuss with you a little bit of what I've learned about the how. So how do artistic interventions, if you want to say, work? And also what can impede them from being successful? And lastly, I want to talk about the importance of intermediaries in this process, because we've spoken about the artists and we've spoken about the researchers or the people in organizations, but we need intermediaries as well. If I'm going too fast, somebody please slow me down. So how do I define artistic interventions in organizations? Essentially as unique journeys. Unique journeys in which people or products or practices, and sometimes all three, from the world of the arts enter organizations that are not arts-based organizations. So sometimes it's just the artist who comes in and works with his or her practices, and sometimes they create within the relationship, they also create artworks. And sometimes we have artworks that are intervening in organizations without the artist being present. But I'm going to be focusing today on those kind of artistic interventions in which the artist is directly involved and engaging with people in the organization. The variety, when I'm saying it's unique and extremely diverse. I found artistic interventions that last just a few hours and others that last several years. And one could assume that something that lasts years has a greater impact than some things that last hours. And I would say that's not the case. I've found examples of situations where the experience has been so intense for a few hours that people will remember it a whole year later. And other cases where artists were engaging with an organization for 3 months and it was forgotten afterwards. So I'll take a look a bit in discussing with you what seem to be the factors that make these events memorable and have a longer term impact. I've seen all different kinds of art forms. So with the IRCAM, you're focusing primarily on music, but in the studies that I've done, I've said a huge range of potential art forms that can be involved. And organizations also of all sizes and all types and from different sectors. I think one of the differentiating factors is how much active participation is there by people in the organization with the artist. So is the artist doing it and the people in the organization are more passive observers of what's happening from the artist, or are they directly engaging with the artist themselves and helping to shape the direction that things are taking and contributing to it? And another very important distinguishing factor is how much organized reflection is there on the experience. Is something done and then people just move on, or is there the opportunity within the organization and between organizations, between different actors, to be reflecting on what was going on, what can we learn from it, what can we take forward from it, and what irritated us as one of the key learning factors. When I look at the outcomes of artistic interventions, there again I'm stepping back and looking at primarily the type that I was seeing, where artists were going into organizations to work on different kinds of topics in the organizations, rather than specially trying to develop a technological innovation of the focus you've had here. What we find is it's very much of a process of working on relationships and developing artful ways of working over time and developing collaborative ways of working. That those seem to be very important processes that is an ongoing dynamic that involves the individual, the team or the department, and the organization as a whole. And when I listen to the managers and ask them, so what is it that you valued particularly? They say something quite different from what the people who often launch these programs, many were paid for, subsidized by the European Union or other public organizations, There was the expectation that managers speak just in hard-nosed business terms. That's the expectation. When I was speaking with managers, listening to them, what it is that they valued most from it, it was very much about the changes they see in the people in their organizations. So they could, when I pressed them hard, because I'm saying the European Union wants me to provide evidence that this is having a real impact, a real business impact, because that's what they wanted us to prove. And I'd have managers who say, okay, if you really put me under pressure, I can say that last year, for example, we had less absenteeism, and that was the year we had the artistic intervention. We had less absenteeism. But you know what? There's very high unemployment out there. So we're not attributing it to the artistic intervention. The things that mattered to me in the artistic intervention was that when I was walking through the company, people were looking at me. When the Prüfer, I'm speaking German, not accountants, what
Evaluators.
What's that?
Evaluators?
Sort of evaluators, yeah, but financial evaluators. What are those people called? Auditors, thank you. When the auditors came, then people would actually, instead of turning away, say, I'd like to explain to you what my work does and how it relates to other parts of the organization. So it changed the way people were thinking about their work, thinking about relationships within the organization, and making sense of things. That's what the managers were actually valuing. So if you put them under pressure, they can provide some numbers, but they themselves don't really trust the numbers. So if you have to produce numbers for decision making as above, I have two suggestions. Either put pressure on the managers the way I did, and they'll give it to you with lots of salt. And if you don't want to waste your time and their time, then take a dice and come up with a number and play around. It's equally important for me in my research to understand what do the artists value out of that. So although we were sent in and funded to do this kind of research to take on particularly the perspective of what does it do for organizations, I also cared a lot about what it does for the artists themselves. And the two most frequently mentioned types of value that the artists found that they had from it was it expanded the scope for their work, for their activity, out of the art world and into different parts of space. They wanted to have an impact on society and found that they could do that within the organizational setting. And it made them more aware of their own competencies. Isolated within the art world, and the signals we get from society is nice to have, do it when you have extra time, when you've got a little bit of extra money. But what they found when working with people in organizations was how important the skills they were that they had taken for granted were valued in the interactions with people in the organization. So there's other things that both managers and the artists valued, but I thought if I'm bringing it down to the essence, those are the aspects that have been most important for them in engaging in these kind of projects. So if I focus largely on that, for those in my research program, why do I now see, particularly through the exposure to these projects here with the STARTS program, why do I see this as a particularly important field of activity, field of interaction? Obviously, one of the specific goals of the STARTS program is how do you stimulate innovations, for example, with materials, with technologies. That's what I've seen here, but I did also, thinking back, see it in some of the programs, the project that I had studied earlier. The interaction with the artists, the challenges that the artists are posing with the scientists, with the engineers, and the questions that the engineers and the scientists are asking of in projects with the artists means that they are pushing technology and pushing the development of new applications, new processes that then come into new products or services. I think a particularly important part, and again this came in the research that I was doing earlier but was reflected in many of the presentations that I was hearing the last few days here, is that artists coming in and working with people who are not in the world of the arts draw particular attention to something that we don't usually talk about or think about, namely the aesthetic and the emotional experience of the processes and of the products of the materials in which we're working with. But possibly the most important underlying element of this is that working with artists generates unexpected questions. Sometimes really basic questions that people in the field, I'm a researcher, and I think that I'm an expert in asking questions. And then you work with artists and they ask you something even more basic or even bigger than the questions we thought we were already asking. So they force us to ask questions that we have difficulties answering sometimes. and thereby generate very meaningful conversations. We're doing what we're supposed to do as academics, as researchers, as scientists, and artists make us think about why are we doing it and force us to make that explicit, which is actually both a difficult challenge but quite a rewarding one, because we realize actually we're doing something important also. We're not just getting paid to do something to give us pleasure that we find in our small worlds, in our small fields of activity is significant, but we can explain better, having worked with artists, why do we need science? Why do we need my kind of research as well? And the artists can help us by challenging us to make that clearer to ourselves and thereby also to others. So with having explored a bit, summarized very briefly, what do I think is the value that can be added? And I think it's quite radical value that working with artists can add generally in organizations and specifically in science and technology interactions. How do I think that they work, from having listened to managers, to artists, and to the employees who've also interacted with the artists? Overall, I think what's very important is that the interaction with the artist opens what we call a temporary interspace within the way we usually do things, the way we think about the way things are done, the way we actually address things in our roles, in our organizations, in our way of working. And in that, within the interspace, the norms of how are we supposed to do things, because we're all very good at doing it, it suspends those norms. It suspends the way we think about things and the way we do things. It interrupts routines and thereby opens the possibility for trying out new ways of thinking and also new ways of doing. What is really important and a key distinguishing factor between artistic interventions and any other kind of interventions for which organizations often pay much, much more than they're willing to pay artists is that the outcome is, by definition, from the outset, not knowable, and there's no guarantee. If we're thinking about, I don't know, I don't want to insult anybody who may be from the consulting world, but one of the roles of consultants is to give a sense of certainty, to enable people to think, it's a very difficult problem, everything is in flux, but I will tell you how it'll work out. This is how we're going to do it, step 1, step 2, step 3. The outcome will be definable and knowable and measurable at the end. When you're working with artists, any artist with his or her salt is going to say from the beginning, I don't know. Because if they knew, they wouldn't bother doing it. It's a waste of their time. So that this sense of not knowing is one of the crucial features that enables something radically new to come out of the interaction. Another distinguishing factor is that cultural difference is seen as a resource. Not as something we have to make up for, but actually it's a resource so that the irritation of working with people who think and do things differently, who think about processes differently, who think about time differently, who think about deliverables differently, is seen as a resource rather than something we have to paste over. I emphasize that a lot because in some programs I've seen there's a tendency to think, well, maybe what we need to do in order to make it easier for the business people, in order to make it easier for the people in the other world, what we should do is train the artists to think and talk like they do. If we get them to think and talk like they do, then go and buy yourself a consultant, do something else. But don't bring in the artist and convert him or her into a member of the other world. The very fact that we have to discover, what do you mean? What's your question? What's your point? That very process is what enables the opening of the interspace, enables the opening of possibilities to try and do something different. The key feature also is the fact that it's not just engagement with our heads. We're very good at that, particularly in science. It's an aesthetic engagement that happens when we're working with artists, when we're talking with artists, when we're engaging with a process with artists. So our whole body can get involved. Emotions as well as the intellect get drawn into the process, which I'm afraid in most of our university programs get excluded. If we're thinking about being trained as lawyers, being trained as doctors, being trained as engineers, we're focusing so much on this part of the body of thing, and we can get stuck at our screens for the longest time and forget to eat, forget to go to the bathroom, forget everything else because we're working so hard. Here, working with artists who also work extremely hard involves actually knowing we have bodies, knowing that we have emotions, and those various emotions play a role in how we think and how we deal with situations. What in this aesthetic engagement, one of the points that came up time and again in the interviews with employees in particular, but also with managers, is how working with artists unleashed energy. They didn't bring their own energy in alone. They actually unleashed the energy that was potentially among people, and people felt confident in opening themselves up, also more with their bodies, also more with their emotions and their spirits. And thereby they worked with the different kinds of responses. If we're thinking about a lot of management training, it's about how to deal with resistance, because resistance gets in the way of implementing what we've planned. And consultants have various techniques to help overcome resistance. The purpose of the arts is to realize resistance is also a form of energy, and realizing within that there's potential. What is the resistance about, and how can we address it? How can we work with it, rather than how can you suppress it? So working with that is a key factor that relates to this aesthetic engagement. And one of the intermediaries that I interviewed in Sweden, I think, captured this very well in saying that he experienced bringing artists into organization as a mixture of bringing sand and oil into the machinery, if you want. That the oil sometimes made things, you need the oil in machinery to help things, make things smoother, make things happen, but you also need the sand to irritate. And so this I find that for me those two images are very powerful to connect with the concept of aesthetic engagement, because of the physical and the emotional dimensions of it. This aesthetic engagement leads to what I've become persuaded of as a strong effect of artistic interventions, that's a potential, is generating memorable experiences, things that people remember years later. What happened in that moment, and what was I thinking, what was I feeling, and who did I discover in my colleague, whether it be the artist or other employees or my boss in the organization. That the memorable experiences then become resources for narrative, so that people can share and pass on the experiences, pass on what they thought they learned, and thereby also passing on some of the energy in order to take ideas forward and to keep believing them beyond the interspace. Continuing this question about how does it work, what strikes me is that artists come in to the organization curiosity driven. And connected with that curiosity is a sense that it's important not to know. And that is for me a complete contradiction to what we're doing in the training programs in our various universities. We're teaching people what they're supposed to know, and also at least to look like they know. If you're in most of our training programs, most of whether business schools or others, it's not a good idea to show that you don't know. So we develop these masks of knowing. And that in today's world, with the speed of change, with the complexity of things, we're really kidding ourselves if we think we know. So working with artists and recognizing not knowing as a resource, as something that's positive, something to work with, something that we can work together with, I think is a great basis for radical innovation. So how do they work with not knowing? Again, aesthetically, with all their senses. So it's a matter of observing. If you don't know, then you're looking much, much more carefully. If you don't know, then you're listening also much, much more carefully. And you're feeling with all your different senses. One of the artists that I was interviewing and observing in a project in Paris some years ago used an image that I found at the time was very, very powerful. She said and she, again, also to explain it, she used her whole body. She says it's like, you know, when she's going into a project, that it's like dipping her hands in the muddy water and keeping them there, and then coming up and seeing what has she got in there. So it's not trying to know everything in advance, not having things all clear, but realizing within that process of exploring, including in muddy water. And if this thing, you know, as I'm talking, I would like you to put your hand into muddy water and get that feeling for what it is, that exploration of you know, so what am I getting here? What's in there that I can't yet see, that I can't yet feel, but by bringing it up, I can see what I can do with it. Another one said, this is from the world of the theatre, she said, is the skills, the ability to analyze with my stomach. Have you heard people talk about that in the boardroom when they're making big decisions on money? Usually not, but it's actually surprising to me when I'm talking with managers how often they say, it was a gut instinct. But yes, afterwards I had to pull up the numbers and make a presentation as though it had all been known in advance. But actually a lot of managers do use their intuition based on experience, but they're not allowed to draw on that officially and not allowed to express it. Artists can. And I think that gives us the legitimacy and the courage to also see what is it that we're really thinking and feeling, how can we use our whole body, including our stomach, in order to sense what's going on. And then think about it. Why am I thinking this? Why am I getting this idea? Where is it coming from? What can I do with it? Until it can be expressed. So through this curiosity-driven engagement of not knowing, the artists manage to engage people with co-learning. So they don't go in to teach the organization, at least the ones that I found most interesting, the ones I found the most exciting things happening, but going in with the spirit, I don't know, and what can we together develop on it, which requires a shift from the organizational perspective, because they're accustomed to having teachers come in or consultants come in and tell them what to do, and it's quite destabilizing at the beginning when the artists come in and say, I don't know. We're going to try and figure it out. And it's not me alone who's going to figure it out. It's not you alone who's going to figure it out. We're going to figure it out in our interaction. So generating the spirit of co-learning, enabling people to experience that with people as different as artists, can then seed the capacity within the organization to continue doing that afterwards with other mixes of people. And connected with that is the capacity that artists have, from the different art forms, of combining inquiry with action. I emphasize that because as an academic, what we usually do is a lot of inquiry first, and then we take some form of action. Most academics means we're writing papers. Other kind of scientists create an object. But what's important in listening to the artists is there's often a long period of inquiry, but that inquiry is often connected with trying some things out along the way. So they do not come in to a project knowing exactly what it is they're going to do. They come in with an idea, with a question, but then a period of trying things out, thinking things through, exploring within the organization in this combination of inquiry and action, getting things to actually happen, trying it out. What I found very important in the cases that I was looking at is to notice that there are 3 levels at which artistic interventions have the potential of having an impact. And I've got some thoughts about how that may be distinct between what's happening in art, science, and technology interactions versus the ones I was looking at. In the ones I was looking at, without an effect at the individual level, nothing is going to happen. So the organizations are often hoping to have something at the organizational level, but if people themselves do not want to engage, then nothing's, we'll go through the act, but nothing serious is going to, nothing, forget the serious word, nothing valuable is really going to come out of it. So if people, and that means if people need to experience value themselves, the individuals in the organizations, the ones who are interacting with the artists, need to feel that it is something that brings them value in some form that they define, not that we define in advance. And essential for that is that they feel safe. Because working with artists is not necessarily comfortable. It takes us out of our comfort zone. It makes us feel incompetent. So that if we don't feel safe with the artist and we don't feel safe under the observation of the normal rules and norms of behavior in the organization, then we're not going to take any risks. And without the capacity and the willingness to engage in a risk and in trying something out, you're not going to get something out of it. So in order to get any kind of organizational value out of the interaction, it's for me essential from what I've seen that individuals themselves feel that they can engage in some sort of value making for themselves. Organizational value can then emerge if senior management has the courage to trust the process. It's already quite daring of managers to say, I'm going to spend organizational resources, time, money, on such an unusual, unknowable type of process. So it takes courage at the beginning. But if they don't have courage to trust the process, then it'll end up by being a very uninteresting type of project. So letting go of control, which is their usual mode of operating in an organization, is very important and very unusual for them. It means that they have to visibly support it, but not control it. The effect of that is that it legitimizes one of the key features that makes it possible for people to make sense of it, to get some value out of it, namely by having sense-making conversations, and then also having follow-up activities. So I mentioned earlier that I'd seen some projects that a lot of stuff was happening and nothing was remembered. And one of the key differentiating factors was there that management had the courage to let it in, then showed no interest in it afterwards, which meant that people who did engage, because they were curious, who did engage, didn't talk about it with anybody. So they had their own little project going on with an artist, but it didn't get reflected on, talked about within the organization, because it didn't seem quite legitimate to be taking time to do that. It wasn't getting connected to what's happening between us within this organization. Then obviously also there's not going to be any follow-up activity. In the projects that I studied, the focus was very much on what can happen in the organization. Nevertheless, working with the artists very often widened the lens of the questioning, what is this about? What are we doing? And thereby generated the capacity to have impacts beyond the organization into the wider society, into whether it be the neighborhood in which the organization was working, in other relationships with other stakeholders in the organization, or just ideas that could go out more widely. Because the artists were asking bigger questions than the one that were posed at the very outset, because they considered the wider impacts of the kinds of activities that the organization was involved in and the potential in this project, and because they involved other actors. Listening to the projects here of the STARTS residency, my thought is, hypothesis is, and it'll be interesting to explore it with you, is that the organizational dimension seems to be quite unimportant, and it's much more about the interaction with the artists, the people involved directly in the project, and then the impact, the consequences for society, for what can be the value of this. I've listened to artists posing really tough questions about why we're doing this kind of thing, what is going to be the impact of this technology, how can we disrupt the impact of this technology, which could be creating harmful effects in society. I've heard very little talk about the organizational impact. I nevertheless believe that it's there, because I think that when artists have been in the organization, already starting to see these conversations, that there's going to be an impact, but I'm thinking it could be a missed opportunity if not more attention to that were being paid in the process of the artistic intervention. I may be wrong, but that was the instinct that I had from listening and comparing in my mind the kind of projects I've studied and the kind of projects that I've been observing here. As I emphasized from the outset, artistic interventions in organizations and artistic relationships with science and technology can have huge effects, can be very valuable, can have a radical potential for innovation. However, there's no guarantee, and there are specific barriers that seem to be, you need to be aware of in order to maximize the probability that something valuable can happen. Something valuable, again, for the individuals involved, if possible for the organization, simply because that means it can continue longer, and then for the wider society. One of the key barriers is the instrumentalization of art, of the artists, and or of the employees. It's a difficult problem to avoid when you're paying for people to come in and do something, because we're used to treating them as instruments, as suppliers. And artists are not suppliers. Artists want to go in as co-creators, as co-learners, and not as people who are treated like the suppliers of an Amazon book delivery. But employees shouldn't be instrumentalized either, also not by the artists. And I've seen a couple of projects where there is a risk of that kind of relationship happening. So realizing it's really about co-learning and equality in the project, and none of the participants, none of the people involved should be instrumentalized. So thinking about that, how are we talking about each other, how are we talking about the relationship? Another barrier to generating value is by having unrealistic expectations. In the kind of projects that I was looking at, often artists were brought in after many other ways of trying to address a problem the organization had been tried. And so artists are supposed to clean it up and make the problem all go away. That's not realistic. And if you're giving them 3 days to do that, maybe a huge impact can happen in 3 days. But if you've taken 3 years to try to figure it out, then expecting the artists to take all the problem away from you is not fair. And when you've got unrealistic expectations, it can frustrate people, but it also can mean that you're not seeing the real value that is happening, because you're looking over here for this kind of value to be generated, whereas the actual value that may be emerging is over here and maybe in a different scope. So the too narrow a definition of value And as I was emphasizing in the beginning, we're often sent in to evaluate these projects with a very narrow definition of what does value look like in organizations. Too narrow of a definition of value and insufficient time invested in the collaboration can be again a barrier to generating the potential, to unleashing the potential for innovation and for change. Lack of follow-up is a real problem, because in the course of the interaction, so many ideas can come up. There's so much energy that's released, so many possibilities get generated that people then say, I'd like to do this and we want to do that. If there is no follow-up, or if there's no explanation why certain things are not followed up upon, then instead what is left is cynicism. So the exact opposite of what could have been happening in the organization gets unleashed, if you want, if no attention is paid to the follow-up afterwards. And I think the last point is one that I made a moment ago in the reverse. It is essential to go with curiosity, because an attitude of knowing rather than an attitude of curiosity and humility is definitely going to be a barrier. If you already know everything, then people are not going to listen to you, people are not going to talk to you, people are not going to express their uncertainties to you because you already know it all. But that's, again, that goes against the grain of how we've been socialized, how we've been trained, and we need to learn how to be vulnerable by expressing our curiosity and by expressing our not knowing in a humble way. So that's a lot to ask of people, to going so much against the grain of how they've been trained to do things, against the norm of how things work in organizations, whether it be academic organizations, whether it be big companies, whether it be small startups. And when I started my research, I was just imagining focusing on the artists and the organizations. Luckily, very quickly, I became aware of the emergence of intermediary organizations, some of which you know. Some of you may have heard of TILT in Sweden, Conexión Improbables in Spain. Vertigo starts here, Art Partner in the Netherlands, for example. Organizations that know how to bring together people from the world of the arts with people from the other worlds, whether it be the academic world, the science world, or the world of NGOs, or the world of profit-making large or small organizations. And they fulfill various roles that are very, very important in order for a project to come to life and to start fulfilling its potential. First, they help organizations to formulate their need, because often there's a very vague sense of what it could be, or a total unawareness of what it could be to work with an artist. And then they find the artist. Finding an artist is possibly one of the most difficult things. You have to have a good network of artists to relate to, and then a good sense of how can this person fit with this organization or with this challenge, with this project. It's a lot of experience goes into that. You can't just look up in the phone book and find a long list of artists and say, go down the alphabet and say this one. And these intermediaries have recognized that they can't even just provide to the organization the kind of artist that they think they want. So they may say, what I want is somebody from the world of the theater. But the intermediary can sense, by listening to the type of project it is, the type of challenge it is, and knowing the people they have in their network, that quite a different art form may be more appropriate, may be more effective. One of the important roles that intermediaries play is finding funds. Taking on the risk of an artistic intervention is difficult, maybe sometimes to legitimize towards other stakeholders in the organization, shareholders if we're talking about that. And with very tight budgets, then helping find the funds for this has been a key activity, which I must say frustrates me a lot, because you've got so much evidence already that very effective things can happen. The fact that we're still needing subsidies because people are too scared to put the money where their mouth is, I find very unfortunate. Nevertheless, I think it's equally important for public funds to realize this is a good for society, so investing in it has also a good reason for being. Another two types of roles that intermediaries can play are training and or accompanying the artists. As I signaled a bit earlier, I'm sometimes a bit skeptical about too much training for artists. I think that Tilt had a very good approach of just developing a sort of overall framework. Conexiones Probables developed its own framework, but they didn't actually train the artists to speak management speak, to speak like business people and act like consultants would do. What they were doing instead is accompanying the artists in the process, the highs and the lows of the process, because the intermediaries have seen a lot of these highs and lows, and for the artists sometimes it's the first time that something like this may happen, this kind of an interaction becomes tricky. So accompanying them in the process is very important, helping them reflect on what's going on, and supporting the process, which sometimes can mean obtaining additional kinds of resources if something turns out to be necessary in addition to what was originally foreseen. So there's various ways of supporting the process. And then reflecting on and reporting on the process. That process, the function of reflecting on what did we do, what happened, why, how can we learn from it, and the we sometimes is within the organization, and equally importantly is learning between projects, between organizations. That's not me. Learning between and so this kind of an event today is that sort of a process of how can we learn from what we've been doing, from what has worked well and from things that haven't worked so well. Equally important to be able to share, to be able to be honest that not everything works easily, not everything worked out as we planned. Why not? So the reflection on the process within and between projects and between organizations. Possibly the most invisible but important role that intermediaries can play is to hold the boundaries between the worlds. Artists need to maintain their stance as artists, their identity as artists, and people in the organization are not going to become artists. Scientists are not going to become artists. We want to learn from each other, but we do have our own codes. We do have our own worlds of reference with which we identify and to which we are accountable. Having the intermediary move between the worlds helps both maintain their identity while understanding and valuing the collaboration and the other persons or the actors' ways of thinking and of doing things. So I think that's probably the most vague concept, but when I'm listening to people talk about what they've been doing, that seems to be an underlying aspect of the relationship between the intermediaries in the interaction between artists and people from the other worlds. So emphasizing the challenges are really great in order to unleash the potential of artistic interventions or artistic intervention residencies in these different kinds of settings, the different kinds of organizations. But you're not alone, because you can draw on existing intermediaries and maybe develop new intermediaries inside the organization sometimes, usually outside, but sometimes you can also have effective intermediaries who develop an appetite for being able to build the bridge between the world of the arts and the world of their own organizations. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Thank you so much, Ariane. This is really great. So we have 5 minutes for questions before the roundtable, the first roundtable starts. If any of you has already a question or a remark. Yes? Yeah.
Oh yes, okay. Marianne, thank you. This was a wonderful talk. I just have a question. When you said that scientists aren't going to become artists and artists aren't going to become scientists, possibly wouldn't we have a better world if we actually did become artists, became scientists, and scientists became artists? Or to think like artists?
I'm going to give two answers. Some really exciting projects, also in the STARTS residencies, are people who became artists, having been coming from the world of technology, and have become artists. So I do have some crossover people. But I think there is a legitimate need for each of our different kinds of disciplines, different ways of thinking and doing things, the ability to communicate, the ability to enrich each other. But I don't think that we should all become one. The ability, I think that maintaining that diversity includes having our own codes, having our own practices, and then bringing them together in order to cross-fertilize. But if we, I love soups, but when you put it all together, it looks brown.
Okay, yes.
Sorry, thank you. You spoke a lot about how to bring together, but I'm interested in asking you about the process of what happens when these relationships take place. How do you document this process? What do you make of it? How do you stabilize it? How do you, put it in one place and then are able to look at it and reflect upon it? What is the methodology you use for that?
It depends who the you is that you're referring to. So if you're referring to me specifically,
The bridging organization.
right? There are different actors in that process. So I'm a researcher who comes in from the outside, and I'm trying to get people to talk about what it is that they were doing and what it is they valued, what they feared, what they enjoyed, what they found exciting, what they found disappointing. And I think it's very important in that process to have to start those questions before the artistic intervention even begins. So we have an awareness of what people were thinking beforehand. If we're trying to evaluate how happy, how satisfied, how disappointed you were, and we don't know where they were in the beginning, then it's very hard to fulfill that arc. And the artists, the employees, the managers in the kind of projects that I was looking at often had very different points of departure. And so if we can't have compare one result if we don't know that there were multiple points of departure. So for me, as a researcher coming in from the outside, that's important. The different intermediaries have developed different processes for how do they document, how do they help the participants document their processes. So there's not one answer to that question. Companies who are not working with an intermediary take less time to document it because it is something that is time consuming, and so everybody's already overburdened with too much to do. So that's another role that intermediaries can do. And sometimes the artists themselves have their own documentation processes, whether it be visual, whether it be audible, or in some form for themselves, but also to share it as they're going along. These artists have to be the type who don't like to isolate themselves while they're doing their work, but are able to work under the gaze of people in the organization, and that sometimes they reveal their work as it's coming along. So there's multiple different answers to your question, but it's an important thing to be thinking about from the outset, and thinking about bringing in external social scientists who have a totally different gaze again, different kinds of ways of questioning it, and enabling them to become visible. And then one of our jobs is to write articles, which is something that can get distributed more widely afterwards. So multiple answers to your question.
So one last question before the roundtable. So I think it was you.
You have the mic?
Yes.
It was me, but I'm happy to cede to someone maybe in the back.
Okay. All right. So
I'm going to be here until tomorrow lunchtime. So.
I'm good, thank you. Well, for the last question then, I imagine that the different organizations pairing or meeting different artists and how that collaboration comes to happen shapes the type of case study, how the institutional culture that is there at the onset and the organizational culture that is there. So I'm wondering if you could give a couple examples of the types of organization that have paired or collaborated with what type of artists and how those came together, or is that for now? Because it's very abstract right now to imagine the diversity of types of configurations that you studied.
I made a really conscious choice, a very tough choice, not to give you any examples, because I figured the course of today, for those of you who weren't here over the weekend, so unfortunately didn't see all the exciting things that the Starts has been doing, the course of today we're going to have more examples. And so I'm happy to give you more afterwards, but if you ask me to do that, that's a whole new speech, and I don't think I'm allowed to take that time.
okay, thank you for this short answer. So now we invite the speakers of the first roundtable